She hadn't planned on staying the night. Emma had come over just to talk, to find a shoulder strong enough to carry the weight she could no longer hold alone. It was one of those winter evenings in Toronto when the snow outside made the world feel even lonelier. She had been holding herself together all day, smiling for coworkers, nodding at strangers, but the moment she stepped inside Daniel's apartment, the smile cracked, and all the sadness spilled out. Daniel didn't ask questions right away. He knew her well enough to recognize that sometimes silence is the kindest thing you can offer. He simply handed her a blanket, brewed her a cup of chamomile tea, and sat with her in the living room. Emma's hands trembled as she wrapped them around the warm mug. She hadn't realized how much she needed this, just being near someone who cared. As the evening stretched, she began to talk about the heartbreak of her last relationship, the crushing loneliness that followed, the heavy burden of pretending everything was fine. Her voice cracked, tears streamed down her cheeks, and she kept apologizing for being so weak. But Daniel shook his head softly every time. "You don't need to apologize for being human," he said, his voice steady and gentle. It was well past midnight when her tears slowed. She was exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that comes from holding pain in for far too long. Daniel quietly set up a spare blanket on the couch for her. "Stay here tonight," he said, almost in a whisper, as if he didn't want to pressure her. "You don't have to be alone right now." She hesitated, her pride wanting to refuse, but her heart knew she couldn't face the cold night outside. She nodded, curling up on the couch, finally letting herself rest. When Emma woke in the morning, the sunlight filtering through the curtains felt different. She hadn't slept so deeply in months. For the first time, she didn't wake up with that hollow ache inside her chest. She rubbed her eyes, and as she sat up, she saw Daniel in the kitchen, making breakfast. The smell of coffee filled the air. He looked up and smiled warmly, the kind of smile that didn't pity her but welcomed her. Then, with surprising simplicity, he said something that stopped her breath. "Good morning, wife." At first, Emma laughed nervously, thinking he was joking, but there was something in his eyes, something steady, sure, and full of meaning. She stared at him, searching for the punchline, but instead found sincerity. He wasn't proposing, not in the usual way. He wasn't rushing her or asking for an answer. What he was doing was even deeper. He was telling her that in his heart, he already saw her as someone who belonged, someone who was cherished, someone he wanted to protect and walk beside through every season. Tears filled Emma's eyes again, but these weren't the tears of despair. These were tears of healing. All those nights of loneliness, of feeling unworthy and abandoned, suddenly seemed to melt away in the warmth of his words. No grand gestures, no rings or rehearsed speeches, just a quiet truth spoken over breakfast that made her feel whole again. They didn't rush into marriage the very next day. Life still had challenges. Emma still had to rebuild her confidence, learn to trust, and Daniel had to show through actions that his words carried weight. But that morning marked a turning point. It was the moment Emma realized love didn't always come in fireworks and sweeping gestures. Sometimes, love arrived softly, in the safety of someone's arms when you had nowhere else to go, in the simple act of making coffee and calling you wife not as a demand, but as a promise. Months later, when they did stand together exchanging vows in front of family and friends, Emma thought back to that morning. To the smell of coffee, the sound of Daniel's voice, the unshakable peace she felt. And she knew in her heart that love wasn't about perfection or fairy tales. It was about finding someone who saw you in your weakest moment and still chose to call you theirs. For anyone listening to their story, it's a reminder that comfort can turn into love, and love can grow quietly until it's the strongest thing you know. Sometimes, all it takes is one night of kindness and one morning of truth to change the course of two lives forever. Do you want me to make this even longer and more emotionally detailed, so it fully fits into a 4-minute YouTube storytelling pace?